This is Dr. Deepak Chopra, and it's my distinct pleasure today to speak to Dr. Brian J. Fertig, who has become a good friend. He and I and Jack Tuzinski, who's a physicist, are writing a new book called Quantum Medicine Towards the Future of Well-Being, or where future of well-being should be, even today. But in the meanwhile, I am absolutely thrilled today to speak to Dr. Brian J. Fertig about his two books. Actually, there is one book in two volumes, Metabolism and Medicine. Volume 1, The Physics of Biological Engines, and Volume 2, The Metabolic Landscape of Health and Disease. So, Brian, can you briefly, first of all, thank you for joining me. It's a privilege to have you. Can you briefly tell me why you wrote this book?
Well, I want to emphasize that I didn't write it for the money. It was quite a journey. And I did it perhaps for the scientific credentials, but really for the loftier goal to improve society, to improve, prolong human life and health spans. And it's important that to recognize the frontiers of medicine are not out in outer space. They're right here in our backyard. And the catalyst of the book was really the unexpected passing of a dear friend and colleague of mine, Walter, back in 2012. He was only 57 years old, the paragon of fitness. He ran 8 miles a day. As a human being, he was kind and humble, fun-loving. Although not a single event, this catalyzed for me a must-do, which is to seek to understand why someone so young and for no apparent reason, like somebody in the world today, would suddenly pass away or be blindsided by some catastrophic diagnosis. This led on to a 10-year journey to better understand the root cause of disease and to find a model that can predict and prevent this type of tragedy from happening to many future Walters.
How old was your friend?
He was 57.
And what was the diagnosis? What was the cause of death?
We don't know. He had an autopsy, it was negative. He was a diabetic and he just took metformin. He was very well controlled, but he was an exercise fiend. He died by the treadmill. So what I suspect, even if you're insulin resistant and you have insulin resistance, you have a 3.5-fold increased risk of sudden death from autonomic neuropathy. And I think that the exercise-induced hypoglycemia triggered a fatal arrhythmia. That's what I suspect.
That makes sense. So, Brian, who does this book target? Who's this book for?
Well, it targets medical practitioners, students, biomedical researchers for the purpose of understanding each other's language and to buttress a scientific creativity that promotes the skill sets for problem solving in medicine. Now, it also targets interested lay people with a high school background in the sciences. Many drafts of this book were made for the goal of improving the demands for clarity to make the information in this book accessible to the general public.
In one sentence, Brian, what's the book about?
Well, the book it's 2 volumes. It covers a wide swath of territory, but in essence, it's about the chronic diseases of aging and through the lens of metabolism and biophysical processes and what causes things to go awry in the context of aging and human behavior.
Let's go a little deeper and a little more granular into, why these 2 volumes. You obviously have 2 volumes. You have a lot to say, the physics of biological engines and the metabolic landscape of health and disease. Can you comment on both these ideas? Take a little time to let me know.
Sure. Thank you, Deepak. Volume 1 looks at the modern disciplines of physics as perspectives for understanding human physiology and to help medicine evolve, which is at levels currently unimaginable. And we take advantage of this potential through the introduction of our physiological fitness landscape model, PFL, which is really the ultimate wellness model for the future of medicine. Now, the intersection of physics, medicine, and philosophy historically is a very important concept and insights. I mean, for example, physician and physicist both come from the same root word, physics, which in turn comes from the Greek knowledge of nature. Now, nature, logic, law, and God are all part of the same logo, which was rooted in Judaic religion, was built into Greek culture, and ultimately Christianity. The idea is that God creates the laws of nature, which is responsible for the infinite wisdom and the organizational perfection of living systems. Now, until the late 1700s, physics was really, it was known as natural philosophy, which dealt with all matters of science, from the stars to the planets to the practice of medicine. In fact, Aristotle and Hippocrates were the father and grandfather, respectively, of modern medicine. Now, since then, since the many decades and centuries, medicine and physics has diverged, and with a gulf between them. However, since physics tends to formulate generalized laws of nature, while biology and medicine seeks details and specifics, underscoring a very different nature of hypothesis and scientific methodology between the two disciplines. The remarriage of the two fields promises an enlightened future for the practice of medicine as an art that sits on top of a more bolstered future. Now, volume 2 is also, there's some key messages that connect the intersection with medicine and physics. And for example, the light-dark cycle was really the umbilical cord. It's the organizing framework for metabolism and physiology of all.
Which cycle? Which cycle?
The light-dark cycle.
Light-dark cycle, yes.
Yeah,
the circadian cycle every day.
It's the temporal
Yeah.
organizing framework of physiology, and it's orchestrated by these molecular clocks, which are astonishing molecular evolutionary microcosms of the Earth's rotation around its own axis. Now, desynchronized physiology within and between tissues, accompanied by chronically activated hormonal and autonomic nervous system branches of the stress response, along with microbiota disturbed composition and diversity, together lie at the core of metabolic decline, with important links not only to obesity and diabetes, but all the chronic diseases of age, including heart, vascular, Alzheimer's disease, and cancers.
So you talk about God, and of course, in scientific circles, God is kind of unfashionable these days. I've been able to talk about intelligence and cosmic consciousness, or pure consciousness, which is the fundamental ground of all existence, that differentiates into knowers, modes of knowing, and those things that are known. And in our case, what we know is a human mode of knowing through which we look at the world. What we call the objective world actually is the perceptual activity in our own consciousness, which is modified by this field of all possibilities, infinite correlation, unpredictable, but creative and self-evolving, self-regulating, self-organizing. I'm comfortable with that word, pure consciousness or universal consciousness, and that we are differentiated aspects of that. Would you go along with that idea that there's the underlying ground of all existence is a field of pure potentiality, past, present, and future, but it is also creative, and it actually is responsible for what we call our metabolism, our perception, our cognition, our biology, that in fact our biological activity, our perception of ourselves and the world, our cognition, our modes of knowing are all modified aspects of this eternal, timeless field of all possibilities. Are you comfortable with that
Well, I
phraseology?
do. Yeah, there's, I do believe that, there are some things that don't, the very fabric of consciousness, such as empathy, compassion, and love, and intuitions. These are not really made in the neurons. They don't live there. So I do believe that there's a universal consciousness that that sort of isn't innate to the human body. I believe that there is, um, that consciousness is a very interesting phenomenon, and it can, this is a discussion in, of itself. But does it, does it come from the universe, or does it come innately from the human body? And I think that there are many examples of where people have, the people that have never been babies, that have never been to other countries, can, with incredible accuracy, recognize, know where things are in the geography and where things exist in another country where they've never been. And they're just 5 or 6 years old. This is, there's lots of examples of these kinds of things. And how do they know this? So there's a lot of fascinating stuff. I just have to say that if time is not a, if time as an absolute quantity is not linear, consistent with special relativity and the Dirac equations, then the past, the present, the future are all happening simultaneously. Imagine the astonishing implications of this on our physiology, on our our reality, our experiences, everyday experiences, and spiritually. It's and it's hard to argue that this is not the case. I just want to say that I had this is one of many. We all think of somebody, and all of a sudden we get an email or text message, and it's not even a loved one. It's somebody you haven't talked about in a long time. And all of a sudden, how did that line up the way it did? I had a patient in the hospital that, and I didn't agree with the management. I called the internist and said, this patient needs this congestive heart failure. She needs a cardiologist. She doesn't need an infectious disease pulmonary. And then the discussion evolved, and I said, wow. As I was talking to her, I said, this conversation, I dreamed this entire conversation, that I brought the past, the future to the present in a dream. Now, how does that happen? I mean, there's so many examples. There's a lot of this stuff in the book.
Once you understand that consciousness actually, or the divine, what infinite, is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. And I think of this in three ways. Omnipotence is infinite energy. Omnipotence is infinite energy. Omnipresence is non-local correlation. And omniscience is infinite knowledge or infinite information. And that seems to pervade all biological systems. How does a human body think thoughts, play piano, kill germs, remove a toxin, and make antibodies all at the same time, while making a baby at the same time and tracking the movement of stars and planets as its own biological rhythm? So I totally get what you're saying. Say a little bit about the ancient Greek philosophers and their notions of reductionism and emergence to empirical observation, and how this ultimately ties in with your PFL model, as you call it, the physiological fitness landscape model.
Sure. Well, the ancient Greek philosophers not only practiced medicine, but their philosophical insights of reductionism and emergence really ushered the development of modern day science and medicine. Reductionism was the legacy of the 20th century and the crown jewel of analytical science and scientific discovery. It taught us the linear systems of biology, such as gene coding of proteins and molecular pathways of cell biology. However, the outcome of the interactions between these pathways could not be predicted by reductionism, leading Aristotle to introduce the notion of emergence as the opposite of reductionism, that is capable of creating a new system whole that is more useful and greater than the sum of its parts. So where does this leave us connect to the current and future of medicine? Well, physicians specialize in the application of art and science to the execution of patient care. So the application of science to the diagnosis of disease and prediction of treatment responses employs principles of reductionism, while emergence, the application of art to the unpredictable elements of human health and disease employ empirical observation, which calibrates risk-benefit profiles followed carefully over time, requiring intuitive non-algorithmic decision-making, including such things as patient fears, expectations, biases, and belief systems. However, to truly evolve medicine to levels capable of reliably prolonging human life and health span will require a more bolstered science capable of regulating emergent processes. Now, this will require a precision, personalized, and dynamic scale of AI. Now, to date, there are personalized scales of AI, like for the management of cancer, for example, but they're not precision mathematical powered. They're not dynamic. They're not predictive, and they're subject to a lot of flawed data in the literature. This led us on to introduce the physiological fitness landscape.
Very, very interesting. No, but you also say that this physiological fitness landscape as a model can apply the theories, Einstein's theory of special relativity, to biological systems. I think most people would never have thought of that. So can you kind of, this is very fascinating to me, that there's a connection between special theory of relativity, which has to do with the fixed speed of time, depending on, doesn't matter where the observer is or what the observer is doing, but there's a limitation to light, and also that both length of objects and time changes with the speed. No, but are you talking about something entirely different?
No, I am talking about a. Let me explain, because I think the special relativity application to the physiological fitness landscape helps us understand the landscape. There's some more basic functions of how the landscape works and what it does, but this is a very important perspective, and I agree. I think this is incredibly fascinating, but simply stated that special relativity does concern the relative rates of the passage of time from the perspectives of, for example, an object approaching the speed of light, for which time is moving slower. We call this time dilation, relative to a stationary observer on the ground for whom time is moving faster. Now, a biological application of this, at least metaphorically, is the divergent rates of biological and chronological aging. Now, in this case, however, it's the slower pace of chronological aging which equates to the stationary observer on the ground as a reference point, relative to the relative faster pace of biological aging. Now, the biological application of special relativity can be plotted on this PFL landscape, and I want you to try to imagine a metaphorical mountainous train of connecting peaks and valleys that describe the metabolic decline that occurs over the lifetime of an individual, whereby biological age equates to fitness. Maximum fitness occurs by the age of 30, when biological and chronological age are the same, and the fitness altitude is at its highest point. Now, a hallmark of this feature is that it's dynamic. It changes with time and biological aging. If the maximum human lifespan approaches 120 years, which would always be the biological age at the time of death, whether that equates to a chronological age of, say, 60, 80, 100, or even 120 years. Now, as biological age progresses, the altitude, fitness altitude declines until it reaches ground level, which is tantamount to death. Now, stay with me here, because the biological application of special relativity is truly about two things. One, the quantum manifestation of energy production as a hybrid with classical metabolism. Two, the resilience of metabolic machinery to the work imposed on it by physical, mental, and circadian stresses. Now, when metabolic resilience is exceeded, the divergence of biological and chronological age accelerate due to inflammation and reactive oxygen species generation, which is coupled to metabolic pathways of energy production. This equates to the heat and randomness of a physical system, which drive entropy, the arrow of time. Now, accordingly, reactive oxygen species oxidatively modify and degrade the molecular chemistry and the fidelity of the exquisite and beautiful organizational complexity of the human body, while inflammatory heat collapses the quantum mode of energy production, which can no longer slow the passage of time or the aging process. Now, conversely, the quantum mode of energy production, quantum metabolism, and in a sense, is the spatially unconstrained flow of energy propagating through the body at rates approaching the speed of light. Accordingly, metabolic rate as an integer of time is slowed, and slower metabolic rate equates to biological aging and slowed motion. Oh, now, there's a caveat here that in the physical special relativity, the relativistic and quantum effects are two separate phenomena. They're independent. Whereas in biological application, special relativity, the relativistic effects are a consequence of the quantum mode of energy production.
I get what you're saying. Now, let me share with you what some of the Eastern wisdom traditions say, because I think you mentioned biological stress, but you also mentioned mental stress. And in Eastern wisdom traditions, and even going back to thousands of years, Yoga Vasishta, he says time is the consumer and we are its food. We are time's food. So if you slow down the experience of time, then you prolong biological age, because biological aging is the metabolism of time, according to this framework. And so with this framework, we have been using meditation as a technique to reduce the experience of time, because, other than the special theory of relativity, our personal experience of time is determined by our internal dialogue. If I'm running out of time, my heart rate speeds up, my adrenaline goes up, my platelets get sticky, and all of that. Cortisol goes up if I'm running out of time. If I have all the time in the world, today we thought we were running out of time because we were late for this. But my attitude is time never runs out. Time is always the eternal, timeless present. So if you're grounded in the present moment, or if your internal dialogue says, I have all the time in the world, or if you transcend time, as sometimes in meditation, this is called samadhi, where the subject-object split disappears. When you transcend time, then even time stops for that moment, of transcendence. Now, based on this, we did a study about 10 years ago, actually. And one of the investigators with us was Elizabeth Blackburn, who at that moment knew nothing about meditation or this kind of thinking about time. but she had won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase, and we convinced her to join our study, which was a 1-week retreat of meditation with control subjects who were on vacation. But at the end of 1 week, the telomerase level went up by something like 40%, which was shocking. And then all the what do you call it, genes that were responsible for self-regulation and homeostasis and inflammation or reduced inflammation, all those genes went up. In other words, the gene activity for self-regulation and homeostasis went up. All the genes that were associated with, say, Alzheimer's, with cancer, with heart disease, with inflammation, with depression, etc., went down. We published this study in Nature Translational Psychiatry. Other people have replicated similar findings in meditation retreats and practice of vagal stimulation and yoga and various breathing techniques. And certainly, it's very obvious to us that our personal experience of time, mental experience of time, influences our metabolic activity. Do you have any comments on this, what I just shared with you?
Oh my God, there's a million. I think that well, I first want to say that this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, which inactivates the cortisol receptor, right? And it gives you more resilience to stress, and it prevents the transition to a burnout phase. Now that's whereas high levels of BDNF is very bad, it promotes burnout, but the moderate amounts, exercise does this. And now it's shown that meditation and yoga, there's early data that's one of the mechanisms that works there as well. But I think that the intersection of physics and medicine applies to the strategies of therapeutic strategies of prolonging human life and health span. And ultimately, the goal is to reduce inflammatory and oxidative stress, which encourages, in my view, this quantum mode of energy production is incredibly efficient, synchronized energy production where you don't really require as much energy. Metabolic rate's actually slower, and you don't create a lot of reactive oxygen species in the process. So as a hybrid of classical metabolism, now, in my view, there's 3 ways to do this. One is you reduce excess dietary consumption, excess physical and mental activity, because that's correlated to the oxygen-consuming energy production. That creates reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress. 2, to reduce circadian stress. It desynchronizes physiology within and between tissues, and bidirectionally, cause and effect uncouples glucose metabolism from the mitochondrial pathways of energy production. Now, mitochondria are the powerhouses of the power plants of cells. They use oxygen to make energy, and that's where most energy is made. That is the sine qua non of metabolic decline when you uncouple that. And that's also the basis of the cardiac stress test in the future, stress testing that we'll use for all specialties. But the third, I hypothesize that the quantum electromagnetic regime of consciousness intuitively synchronizes with the quantum metabolism mode of energy production systemically as a model for mind-body phenomenon. Now, this could be accomplished in two ways. One, meditation, mindful meditation, and mind-controlled physical activities such as yoga. 2, vitalizing activities such as that engage skill sets and personal resiliences. And there's 2 forms of this. One is physiological. The behaviors of physiological purpose, where nothing elevates us more than become part of a new system whole that's greater than the sum of its parts by promoting the joys and the opportunities, the health and general welfare of others, which are inseparably entangled to those of our own. Now, the second way that the form of this is through goal-oriented behaviors. So this requires energy, but it slows the pace of biological aging relative to the energy put into it, in the sense that, and this equates for all vitalizing behaviors, that it doesn't exceed metabolic resilience, and two, it couples the quantum physiological manifestations of consciousness in energy production. Now, can I just say one more thing? Because this is, in Okinawa, Japan, there's the highest number of centenarians in the world. Now, as I understand it, these people don't do a lot. They don't work hard, and they don't eat much either. So it's been questioned, do they truly live this long, or it just seems that they do? But in all seriousness, now the attitudes between the East and West, the East or the West, Europe and North America, we're very individualistic. We're motivated by goal-oriented accomplishments and pride. Whereas in the East and Asia, it's about a collective sense of collective belonging, family, community, and a strong social bonding. So this notion of collectivism and individualism, or an integration of the two, which I believe is these concepts are critical to considering how we live our lives. And it's just this idea could be discussed forever.
It's fascinating to me how you kind of discuss the causes of inflammatory and oxidative stress relationship with metabolic resilience, and that your model of quantum metabolism is in a way a hybrid to classical metabolism. And you hypothesize synchrony of quantum physiological manifestations of consciousness and energy production. And you also discuss in your model, and you just did, differences in attitudes of Eastern and Western cultures. But you do have in your books a formalized lifestyle model, a qualitative model of what you call PFL, the fitness landscape model. Share a little bit about this formalized lifestyle model.
Sure. No, I think this is key, because the quantitative model of the physiological fitness landscape will require a scientifically integrated cultural shift, and therefore a longer time horizon. However, there's also a qualitative version that offers some immediate insights and take-homes for your audience. Society has long recognized that lifestyle behaviors can promote or delay the onset of chronic disease. However, to date, there's never been a formalized model that puts this into practice. Now, lifestyle behaviors are stress behaviors in the sense that they're not dormant. They're not dormancy. That all stress behaviors can be either vitalizing or toxic. And a nice caveat is that no toxic stress behavior exists in isolation. So for example, when you're stressed out, half of us undereat, half of us overeat, but we all eat the wrong kinds of foods. We all eat the wrong kinds of the day. Now, the stress behaviors can be described as a quartet of trios, where they are either physical, mental, or circadian in nature, defined by the quantity, quality, or timing of diet, sleep, or activity. And activity, in turn, can be described as physical, cognitive, or social in nature. Now, when the quantity, quality, or timing of any of these stress behaviors is excessive or poor, that generates, inflammatory cytokines, which loop back on the brain, reduce the threshold of the perception of stress, activate the branches of the stress response, desynchronize physiology, and disturb the microbiota, in this self-amplifying matrix of pathogenicity. Now, let me just describe an application of the PFL model quickly using a single physiological parameter of body weight for simplicity and overeating as a control parameter, which is a relatable way to understand many of the key features of this terrain. So the valley between mountains is a stability zone. It can be a body weight set point. And then there exists, just before reaching the top of the mountain, a threshold of criticality, whereby up until that point, simply removing the stress behavior is enough to restore metabolic stability, such as the prior body weight set point. However, if you continue to overeat, you push through that threshold and you reach the top of the mountain, now that's an instability zone where you cannot get your footing. And even after the overeating stops, you continue to gain weight until you fall off the cliff on the other side of the mountain into a new valley at a lower fitness altitude, higher body weight set point, and the new onset of metabolic disease states such as high blood pressure, elevated lipids, or new onset diabetes.
As you know, our profession, the medical profession, is particularly vulnerable to burnout and toxic stress because of disruption of circadian rhythms, because of time deadlines, because of not being able to meet the needs that people have, at the same time take care of yourself. And caretakers are particularly subject to toxic stress and burnout. You think your model should really help our profession more than anybody else's,
Well,
because we are at more risk than even other people.
yes, for sure. I think that, we are this notion of promoting the joys and the opportunities to health and general welfare is so fundamental to health. But if with burnout, what happens is, a few things. First you get the cortisol responsiveness, which drives which, for example, it works on the cognitive and emotional centers. But one thing is it drives the fear response. And anger is rooted in fear. The chronic fear doesn't really exist. It's imaginary. However, the consequences of anxiety and depression are not imaginary. For example, depression is associated with a 30, it's got a greater odds ratio for causing heart disease than any of the classic Framingham risk factors: high blood pressure, cholesterol, cigarette smoking, or diabetes. And it portends a 30% increase incidence of an acute cardiovascular event, such as a heart attack, and a 36% incidence of a fatal arrhythmia, sudden death. I want to say that Mark Twain had a very apt quote. It's one of my favorite quotes of his, that I've suffered a great number of tragedies in my life, and most of which never happened. Now, your audience should, that's a take-home message that everyone should remember. But the burnout stage, if exercise, yoga, and meditation really do promote this BDNF in a way that increases resilience and prevents the transition to burnout. But think about burnout if you no longer have the fear response. So burnout, not having a fear response, is worse than not having the fear. Think about it not having fear of the consequences of giving up. For example, leading to things like alcohol and drug addiction, divorce, and even suicide. And if it hardens your core values, what really makes us unique as human beings, what makes us successful in life, what makes us good physicians, and things like empathy, compassion, intuition, humility, and conscientiousness. When you lose these things, you are, not only is it bad for you, but think about the poor patients. And in fact, anyone, independent of whatever specialty you're in. I think it is uniquely, medicine is a unique example where it's very sensitive to burnout, and physicians or healthcare providers are subject to this. but it really applies to all professions and all people, because it's a very stressful world we live in on many scales.
I've been speaking to uh, Dr. Brian J. Fertig, who's the author of these wonderful 2 volumes, Metabolism and Medicine, and the physics of biological engines. And of course, part 2 is metabolic landscape of health and disease. As I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Fertig, I and Jack Tuzinski are now writing a book called Quantum Medicine, and it's about the future of well-being. So before I finish, just want to mention that these 2 books are extraordinary in that they not only give us the science, but the prescription for healthy aging, for a prolonged life, for what we call increasing health span, but they go very deeply into, the mechanics, the cortisol mediated versus cortisol inactivated mechanics of the stress response and their manifestations as well. So Brian, before we end, a little bit about your background, but it's very interesting that you're in this wonderful place. You're a professor, you teach. Share a little bit about, you did share your personal reasons for why you wrote this book, but share with our audience a little bit about, your background that qualifies you to write this amazing book.
Well, thank you for that question, actually. I'm a medical practitioner, and I specialize in endocrinology, diabetes, and metabolism. I've been in practice.
Like myself, I'm also an endocrinologist by training.
I wanted to say that too. Now, I've been in practice almost 3 decades. Now, you, Deepak, launched your medical career in the same hospital that I started my medical practice, Muhlenberg Hospital in Plainfield, New Jersey. Now, I grew up, I was born and raised in Plainfield. But there's more serendipity between us. Like you just said, we're both endocrinologists. We're both interested in the intersection of medicine and physics. And we're both, we both collaborate with the same genius in physics, Jack Tuzinski. And I want to say something that if he weren't such a humble guy, you would never know if you didn't look at his legendary 80-page CV that he was hired by the governments of Italy, France, and now Germany to organize for science. He's the ambassador of science of Canada. He's a Nobel Prize nominator in physics. And you, Deepak, were named as the one of the greatest icons and heroes of the century by Time magazine. I am truly standing on the shoulders of giants, and I am grateful for the honor and the privilege.
You're very, very kind, Brian. Final words. What do you hope the book will achieve?
Oh, this is a good one. As a healthcare practitioner, I have been and remain focused on finding and treating the root cause of disease. Through the PFL model, we can change the future of medicine and medical practice by predicting and preventing the onset of disease before it's too late. So I invite the global scientific and medical communities to join this transformative journey and next evolution of a scientifically integrated cultural shift in the practice of medicine and healthcare delivery.
It's been a great privilege for me to speak to Brian J. Fertig. And as I mentioned, we are going to be coming out with quantum medicine, the future of well-being. But in the meanwhile, if you are an academic or a medical student or a resident or a physician or somebody who's interested in health span, lifespan, longevity, and how we can optimize self-regulation in our bodies through a deep understanding of both Eastern and Western philosophical systems, but also sciences, then this is the book for you to read right now. And I encourage you in not only reading the book, but sharing it with your friends and actually starting some discussion groups around the topics of this book. Brian, it's been a privilege to speak with you, and we shall continue this conversation in future sessions. Thank you
Thank you
so
very
much.
much. Thank you,
Thank
Deepak.